I would not have taken this far if I didn't have compelling evidence of facts that reveal why the decision was made.
A DNA bombshell sits at the heart of the British monarchy, and Prince Harry is at the center of it all. William knows something, Charles is caught in the middle, and the crown itself is holding its breath. What is the royal family hiding, and how far will William go to protect the throne? Join us as we reveal the truth behind the Windsor dossier. William draws the line. For years, the rumors had floated around the edges of the internet, and most people ignored them, treating them as nothing more than online noise. The royal family never acknowledged them, and life inside the palace carried on as normal. But at some point, the whispers stopped feeling harmless, and they started feeling like something far more serious. It was around this time that Prince William reportedly made a decision that would change the direction of everything. A private DNA report had been prepared, though exactly who commissioned it and why was never made fully clear. What was clear was William's response, and it was swift. He rejected it. On the surface, this might look like a simple personal choice, a man refusing to engage with something painful and uncomfortable. But the people watching from inside the institution understood that something much bigger was happening, because William was not just pushing away an unwanted document. He was drawing a firm line around what the monarchy could and could not accept. His position was straightforward, and it came down to one thing, which was process. A private report prepared outside official channels had no legal standing, no verified chain of custody, and no recognized authority behind it. If questions about identity and lineage were going to be answered, they would need to be answered the right way, through official systems, through proper verification, through processes that could actually hold up under scrutiny. This was the moment everything shifted, because what had once seemed like a private family matter was now something else entirely. It had become a question of institutional control, of who gets to decide what is true and how that truth must be proven. William had made his position clear, but the questions were already spreading, and they were only getting louder. The questions begin to multiply. The rejection of the private DNA report did not make the questions go away. And in many ways, it made things worse, because when people in powerful positions refuse to engage with something, the silence itself becomes a kind of answer, and the public has a way of filling that silence with suspicion. The first question that kept coming up was a simple one, which was why private testing in the first place. If there was nothing to hide, and if the rumors were nothing more than baseless internet gossip, then the existence of a privately commissioned report felt strange, because official channels exist for exactly these kinds of situations, and the fact that someone had gone outside those channels was something people could not easily explain away. The second question followed naturally from the first, and it was just as uncomfortable. Why had the process been handled the way it was, quietly, without transparency, and without any formal acknowledgement from the palace? The royal family had faced difficult moments before, and the institution had always leaned on structure and procedure to get through them. So the decision to handle something this sensitive, in an informal and private way, felt deeply out of character, and that inconsistency was something people noticed. What made things harder was the lack of clarity coming from any direction, because nobody was stepping forward to explain the reasoning, and nobody was offering a straightforward account of what had actually happened. The palace stayed quiet. The people closest to the situation said nothing publicly, and the gap between what was known and what was being said kept growing wider with every passing day. This is often how institutional scandals take shape, not through dramatic revelations, but through the slow accumulation of unanswered questions, and each question that goes unanswered gives the next one more weight, so that by the time the story has been circulating for weeks, even small details start to feel significant, and the public starts connecting dots that may or may not actually be connected. The tension was no longer just about a rumor, because the rumor had now attached itself to something real, which was the way the situation had been handled, and that handling was raising serious doubts about transparency and trust at the very highest levels of the institution. People were not just asking whether the rumors were true anymore. They were asking why the truth seemed so difficult to reach, and why the systems that were supposed to provide clarity appeared to be working against it. The answers were not coming, but something else was, and it was hiding in plain sight. The pattern of inconsistency. One unanswered question is easy to dismiss. Two can be written off as coincidence. But when a pattern begins to form, it becomes much harder to look away. And that is exactly what started to happen as more people began paying closer attention to the details surrounding this story. The scrutiny began with public appearances, which might seem like an unusual place to start, but appearances carry enormous weight inside the royal institution because everything is managed, everything is deliberate, and nothing happens by accident. So when something looks slightly off, it tends to stay off in a way that is difficult to ignore. Photographs from different periods were being placed side by side and examined carefully. And while photographs can be misleading, and comparisons of this kind are rarely reliable on their own, the sheer volume of people pointing to the same things created a kind of collective pressure that was difficult for the palace to simply wave away. People were not just looking at faces, they were looking at timelines, at dates, at who was where and when, and the picture that was emerging was not entirely consistent. Then came the questions around official documents, because birth records and formal registrations carry a different kind of weight, and any inconsistency found within them is not something that can be explained away as a matter of interpretation. Several people began pointing to details within official records that appeared to have been revised or updated at different points in time, and while document revisions are not automatically suspicious, the timing of certain changes drew attention in ways the palace had not anticipated. What was building was not a single piece of damaging evidence, but something more complicated and in some ways more dangerous, which was a pattern of small inconsistencies that individually meant very little, but together created a growing sense of doubt. And doubt, once it takes hold in the public mind, is extremely difficult to dislodge. The institution had always relied on its image of certainty and permanence, the idea that its records were clean, its history was clear, and its lineage was beyond question. So when that image of certainty began to crack, even slightly, the effect was felt far beyond the specific details being examined. Trust is not lost all at once. It erodes slowly, through small moments and quiet contradictions. And by this point, the erosion had already begun. And the people inside the institution, who understood what was at stake, were watching it happen in real time. The pattern was visible now, and once something like that becomes visible, it cannot be made invisible again. But the most unexpected detail was still to come, and it would arrive in the form of a number so small it should never have mattered. The $499 detail. Most major scandals are not broken open by dramatic revelations or sweeping exposés. They are cracked apart by small things, by a single receipt left in the wrong place, a name on a document that should not be there, or a number that does not quite fit the story being told. And in this case, the number that caught people's attention was $499. On its own, that figure means almost nothing. It is not a large sum of money. It does not point obviously to wrongdoing. And in the context of an institution that operates in the hundreds of millions, it barely registers as a rounding error. But the significance of this particular figure had nothing to do with its size, and everything to do with what it appeared to represent. The details surface through the kind of slow, patient digging that tends to happen when a large number of people become determined to find something. And what it appeared to suggest was that a financial transaction had taken place outside of the normal official systems. A transaction that was small enough to avoid obvious scrutiny, but specific enough in its amount to suggest it was not accidental. $499 is a number that appears frequently in informal or off-record processes because it sits just below the threshold that triggers certain kinds of financial reporting and oversight. And people who have worked in financial compliance recognized the figure immediately and understood what it might mean, which was that someone had been very deliberate about keeping something just out of view. This is how institutional cover is often maintained, not through dramatic concealment, but through careful navigation of the edges of what requires disclosure, staying just inside the boundaries of what can be ignored, while still conducting a process that was never meant to be visible. The detail spread quickly once it was picked up, because it gave people something concrete to point to, something that existed in the real world as a number attached to a transaction, rather than as a theory or an interpretation, and that concreteness changed the nature of the conversation in a significant way. People who had been willing to treat the story as speculation began to reconsider, because speculation is easy to dismiss, but a financial trace is something different entirely. And the question of what that $499 was actually paying for became one of the most searched topics connected to the story. Scandals hide in small anomalies, and this one had just been found, but finding it only raised a deeper question, one that the institution was now being forced to answer. The institutional response. When an institution as powerful and as carefully managed as the British monarchy feels threatened, it does not panic. It organizes, because panic leaves traces and traces become evidence. So instead of reacting emotionally, the people at the top of the structure begin pulling systems into place, quietly and deliberately, in a way that is designed to look like order rather than damage control. That is precisely what began to happen as the pressure around this story continued to build, because the palace had watched the narrative grow from an internet rumor into something that was attracting serious attention, and the point had arrived where silence alone was no longer a sufficient response. The first thing the institution moved to establish was control over the verification process itself, because one of the central problems with the private DNA report that had already surfaced was that it existed outside of any system the palace recognized, and that meant it could not be managed, challenged, or dismissed through official means. So the response was to make clear that any legitimate process would need to operate through channels the institution controlled and sanctioned. This meant demanding specific things, and the demands were precise, because precision is how institutions protect themselves. So what was being required was a verified chain of legal custody for any material involved, confirmation that only recognized authorities had handled the process, and a clear record of every step taken from beginning to end, the kind of documentation that would make any result defensible and any challenge to it difficult to sustain. These were not unreasonable demands on their face, because proper verification does require exactly these kinds of safeguards. But the way they were being applied told a more complicated story, because the effect of setting such a high and specific bar for what counted as acceptable was that almost everything that had already been done fell outside it, and that meant the conversation could be reset, redirected, and brought back under institutional management. The escalation that followed was significant, because what had begun as a private family matter was now being handled with the kind of procedural seriousness that is normally reserved for matters of state. And that shift in tone sent a very clear signal to everyone watching, which was that the people inside the institution understood exactly how serious this had become. Legal advisors were being consulted, internal briefings were being prepared, and the language coming from those close to the palace was becoming more careful and more formal, which is always a sign that the stakes have risen beyond what informal management can handle. The monarchy has survived centuries of challenge precisely because it understands how to use structure as a shield, and that is what was happening now. The apparatus of the institution was being deployed not just to investigate a claim, but to contain one. But containing a claim and resolving it are very different things, and the people being asked to resolve this one were already being assembled behind closed doors. The shadow panel. There is a point in any serious institutional crisis where the people responsible for protecting the institution stop reacting and start planning. And that point had clearly been reached, because, according to sources familiar with the situation, Prince William had begun assembling a group of people whose job it would be to look at everything, examine it carefully, and determine what the institution's next move should be. This group was not announced publicly. It carried no official title, and its existence was not confirmed through any formal channel, which is exactly how these kinds of bodies tend to operate when the stakes are high enough that visibility itself becomes a liability. Because the moment something like this becomes public knowledge, it stops being a tool for managing the situation and becomes part of the situation itself. What was known about the composition of this group was that it brought together people from very different disciplines, and that breadth was intentional, because the problem being examined was not a single kind of problem. It was several different kinds of problem layered on top of each other, each requiring its own form of expertise. Legal experts were involved because the questions at the center of this story had legal dimensions that could not be ignored, particularly around the standards of evidence required to establish or challenge matters of identity and lineage within a constitutional framework. And the bar for that kind of determination is extremely high. which meant the legal thinking had to be precise and defensible from the very beginning. Historians were also part of the conversation, because the monarchy's legitimacy is not just a legal question, it is a historical one, rooted in centuries of precedent, tradition, and documented succession, so any conclusion reached would need to be understood within that longer context, and the historians in the room were there to make sure that context was not lost in the urgency of the immediate situation. Constitutional advisors rounded out the group, because at its deepest level, this was a constitutional matter, touching on questions about who holds the right to inherit, what processes exist for resolving disputes about lineage, and what the consequences of different outcomes might be for the structure of the institution itself. And those questions do not have simple answers, which is why the people being asked to work through them were among the most experienced in their fields. The transition that this group represented was significant, because the story had moved decisively from the realm of rumor into the realm of formal review, and that meant the outcome was no longer something that could be managed through public silence or careful media handling alone. A process is now underway, and processes have a momentum of their own. They generate findings, and findings demand responses, and responses change things in ways that cannot always be predicted or controlled. The panel was working quietly, but what it was working toward was anything but small. Bloodlines and money. Every major royal crisis eventually arrives at the same two places, which are legacy and money, because those are the things the institution is ultimately built around. And when a question about identity sits at the center of the story, both of those things become unstable at the same time, and the combination is uniquely dangerous. Diana's name had been hovering at the edges of this story from the beginning, present but not central, acknowledged but not examined, and that changed as the situation escalated. Because it became impossible to talk seriously about questions of lineage and inheritance without talking about what Diana represented, both to the institution and to the public that had never stopped grieving her. Her legacy is not a simple thing. It carries enormous emotional weight inside Britain and far beyond it, and it sits in a complicated relationship with the institution she was part of. Because Diana was loved in ways the monarchy itself has rarely been loved, and that love transferred in very visible ways to her sons, which means that anything touching on the question of their identity also touches on her memory, and that makes the emotional stakes of this situation almost impossible to overstate. But alongside the emotional dimension, there is a financial one, and the financial dimension is in some ways even more difficult to navigate, because money follows legitimacy inside the royal institution, and legitimacy is precisely what is being questioned. The implications of an identity dispute at this level reach into inheritance structures, into the formal recognition of titles and positions, and into the future allocation of resources that flow through the institution across generations. And while photographs can be misleading, and comparisons of this kind are rarely reliable on their own, and none of those things can be separated cleanly from the question of whether the documentation and verification surrounding a person's identity is considered complete and official. Harry's position in all of this had always been personal, rooted in family, in grief, in a sense of belonging that he had spoken about publicly and painfully over many years. And the way he was approaching the situation reflected that, because for Harry, the question was ultimately about who he is and what that means to the people around him. William's position was different, and the difference mattered, because William was not approaching this as a brother working through something painful. He was approaching it as the future head of an institution that cannot afford ambiguity, and the procedural firmness he had shown from the beginning was a reflection of that responsibility rather than a lack of feeling. The divide between the two brothers was not simply emotional versus cold, it was personal versus institutional, and both positions made complete sense within their own logic, which is what made the situation so genuinely difficult, because there was no version of this where both of those things could be fully honored at the same time. Something was going to give, and the moment that forced the decision was already approaching. The return to London. There are moments in a long and complicated story where a single image says more than any official statement ever could, and the image that stopped people in their tracks was a simple one. A private jet touching down at a London airport in the early hours of the morning, carrying Harry and his children, but not Meghan Markle. The arrival had not been announced, there was no press conference scheduled, no official explanation offered, and the silence around it was total which is exactly the kind of silence that generates the most noise. Because people who have been following a story as closely as this one had been followed know how to read what is not being said. And what was not being said here was very loud indeed. The fact that Harry had brought his children was the detail that landed hardest, because children are not brought into situations like this casually. Their presence carries meaning. And the meaning most people attach to it was that this visit was not routine. It was not a quiet family check-in. It was something that Harry felt his children needed to be part of, for reasons that had not been explained, but that felt significant in a way that was difficult to ignore. The absence of Meghan Markle added another layer entirely, because the two of them had appeared together so consistently, in public and in private, through every difficulty and every controversy, that her absence from this particular moment felt deliberate rather than incidental, and deliberate absences in the world of royal optics are almost never without meaning. Speculation moved quickly across every platform that had been tracking the story, and the theories ranged widely, from the idea that her absence was a gesture of goodwill toward a family that had never fully accepted her, to the suggestion that what was about to happen inside those private meetings was something Harry needed to face on his own terms, without the added complexity that her presence would inevitably bring. What nobody could agree on was what the visit actually meant in terms of the larger situation, because the optics were carefully controlled in a way that gave very little away. The children were not photographed. Harry was not photographed, and the only confirmation that any of it had happened came through sources rather than through anything official. But controlled optics are still optics, and the fact that someone had made very deliberate choices about what would and would not be visible told its own story, because you do not manage an arrival that carefully unless what is happening inside it genuinely matters. Something had shifted, and the next few hours would determine how much. The King's impossible balance. There is a particular kind of pressure that has no clean solution, where every possible response causes damage of one kind or another, and the only real question is which kind of damage the person at the center of it is most able to live with. And that is the position King Charles found himself in, as this situation moved toward the moment where a decision could no longer be avoided. On one side of the pressure was his role as a father, a man who had watched his family fracture in very public and very painful ways over many years, who had seen the distance between his two sons grow into something that looked increasingly permanent, and who understood at a personal level what it would mean for that distance to become total, because families do not recover easily from ruptures of this kind, and the older a man gets, the more clearly he tends to see that. On the other side was his role as the monarch, the head of an institution that has survived for centuries, precisely because it has always placed its own continuity above the personal needs of the individuals within it. And that continuity depends on clarity, on defined lines of succession, on processes that are recognized and respected, and on the appearance of stability, even when the reality behind it is anything but stable. The problem was that these two roles were pulling in opposite directions, and there was no position Charles could take that would fully satisfy both of them. Because the things a father might want to do in this situation and the things a monarch must do are not the same things, and pretending otherwise would only delay the damage rather than prevent it. What made the balance even harder to maintain was the question of trust, because trust was identified by those close to the situation as the thing that had been most seriously damaged through all of this, not just between the brothers, not just between Harry and the institution, but between the palace and the public that had been watching everything unfold with a combination of fascination and genuine concern. Trust, once broken at this level, does not return quickly or easily, and the people advising Charles understood that whatever decision was made would be judged not just on its immediate effects, but on whether it demonstrated that the institution was capable of being honest about difficult things. No decision available to Charles avoided damage, and he knew it, but one decision was coming that would make everything else irrelevant. William had made up his mind, and what he was about to say could not be unsaid. The decision that changes everything. Every long and complicated story eventually arrives at a moment where everything that has been building, every question, every silence, every carefully managed appearance, comes down to a single point. And for this story, that point was a speech, one that William had reportedly been preparing with the same quiet deliberateness that had defined his approach to the entire situation from the very beginning. The people around him knew it was coming. The advisors, the legal experts, the constitutional specialists who had been working through the implications of every possible outcome, and they understood that whatever William said in that speech would set the direction of everything that followed, because there are statements that can be walked back and statements that cannot, and this was going to be the second kind. Two broad paths lay in front of him, and each one led somewhere very different, because if the outcome of the formal review process was full validation, then the speech would need to open a door toward reconciliation, towards some kind of acknowledgement that the questions had been examined seriously, and that what had been found demanded a response grounded in honesty rather than institutional convenience. And that path, while difficult, carried with it at least the possibility of something being repaired. But if the outcome was partial or negative, then the speech would mark something else entirely. The moment the institutional rupture became official, the point at which the distance between Harry and the Crown stopped being a family difficulty and became a constitutional fact, with consequences that would reach far beyond the two brothers and into the structure of the monarchy itself. The people watching from outside had no way of knowing which path had been chosen, and that uncertainty was its own kind of pressure, because the stakes were understood clearly enough by this point that almost nobody was treating the outcome as a matter of simple curiosity. What sat at the center of everything, the question that all the legal frameworks and verification processes and constitutional deliberations had never quite managed to answer cleanly, was a much older and more human one, which was whether truth, proof, and the preservation of the crown could ever truly exist together, or whether honoring one of them fully always required sacrificing another. William stepped forward, and the world went quiet. What he said next would change the House of Windsor forever. Drop your thoughts in the comments section below, like this video, and subscribe for more incredible stories just like this one.